The Gospel of Mark reports to us what was remembered by those who were his source of information, that Jesus then predicted that Peter would deny, not naming him out, but that there would be one who would deny him and then one who would betray him. Hear these words, interesting. Jesus said to them, "All of you will run away and leave me, for the scripture says God will kill the shepherd and the sheep will all be scattered. But after I am raised to life, I will go to Galilee ahead of you." Peter answered, "I will never leave you, even though all the rest do." "Remember this," Jesus said to Peter, "before the rooster crows 2 times tonight, you will say 3 times that you do not know me." Peter answered even more strongly, "I will never say I do not know you, even if I have to die with you." And all the disciples said the same thing. Now, in I think it was 4th or 5th grade, as a tender of the Columbus, Wisconsin Methodist Episcopal Church at the time, I was given my own King James Version translation of the Bible. Even back then, we thought it was Saint James, but it was a king, and he was not a saint, except in his desire to have one language that everyone could read and understand. And so to him, we offer his great credit. So I began to read the stories, very simple stories about Old Testament people who had been told to me by my mother in particular. And so I learned very quickly about these great heroes that were part of the history of the early church that started way back in Israel. So King David, Abraham, Noah, and the ark, the story of a huge number of prophets who were unique and special. And I heard all of the stories, in a sense, in a real condensed, simple way. So as a child, I just learned the basics. And that was important because I had those basics then. So I then went as a 7th grader into the confirmation class, which was a 2-year class. And the minister was a wonderful guy. We had a change in the middle of time, and Lowell Reichdahl, who was our minister, Theodore Reichdahl, who was our minister, moved to another church, and we received a new minister who turned out to be a wonderful guy and made it even more delightful to be part of the church because he was such a basically human person and just a good human being. It took a liking to both my brother and myself, and we would hunt together, fish together, and just sit and talk a lot together. So I felt really good about the church and comfortable being a part of it. We learned the parables of Jesus. We learned a whole lot of stories about Paul and Silas and a score of others who were part of the New Testament. And then I began to grow in my understanding of the scriptures, both in terms of their meaning, but in terms of the content and the context. And it was then that I discovered that there were actually 2 stories of creation. And I was curious to know, how come? How come there are 2 stories? We only need one. And it was the beginning of my raising questions and seeking some understanding and perhaps even truth from the authorities, who were obviously the people who were teaching our class in confirmation, our ministers, the youth director, who was a wonderful person. Then I also began to read stories about what Paul had to say. And I discovered that Paul was talking about his faith journey. And at one point he said, I used to behave and think and feel like a child, but now I've grown up. And he's using that symbolically as a way of saying our early faith was a very simple faith, but now it is a much more mature faith. It is filled with a much more knowledge and understanding. And it comes to us not only in terms of what we have learned from the gospel accounts and from the Old Testament and from Paul, but now we're learning from life experience. And so what I discovered was that I needed to grow even more. My intent, as some of you know, was to go to school and be an attorney. Then I got sick, and then I went to school and I was going to be a teacher. And then I met a minister in Oshkosh who really liked us as young people and said, you know, have you ever considered becoming a minister? Well, I thought about it, but I would want to be a teacher now. And after a while, I decided, no, I really do want to do that. So I went to seminary, and that was like incredibly eye-opening. Now we're studying the Bible with greater intensity and greater depth. And now we're looking at each of the stories and each of the comments in the context in which they were given and shared. And I understood, you know, the struggle that some folks were having with literalism and a broader way of understanding scriptures than literal, because there's some real difficulty that I have with literal, because when you talk about the first Adam and Eve, and then the second creation tells us that God was looking for a companion for Jesus, had searched all over for a companion. But not that he hadn't found other women who could have been his companion, but none of them were worthy of him. Wait a minute, there are more people there. So I began to understand, at least from my point of view and from what I thought was reasonable insight, that this was the way that the early faith of the Jewish people, that they could describe how the earth was created and how humans were created. And it fit our understanding of the great affection and love for God and his immense creative capacity. I also discovered in seminary a whole lot more things about the prophets. They were prophets who were making messages and making enemies at the same time. Jesus pointed that out at one point, that the prophets would speak and then people didn't like it, and so they killed them. You might remember that it was Jeremiah, who was a young man. He didn't want to do it. He knew what the prophet's outcome was going to be, and so he resisted the call by God to be a prophet. And God was persistent, like the hound of heaven. He was not about to let Jeremiah off the hook. And so he said, I'll give you the words and you'll be all right. Well, all right meant that he was thrown in prison once and was beaten and punished and thought he was going to die. But he still proclaimed the good news, which was the painful news that, in fact, the earth that they were living on was going to be consumed by war and conflict, and they become slaves to either Babylon or Persia or one of the other great powers around them. The prophets spoke with power, and they spoke to people of power. The prophet spoke to King David, whom I thought was just this wonderful saintly man, only to discover more intensely that he really was a pretty thoughtless and careless person, at least in terms of his relationship that he developed with Bathsheba, and then the killing of his very important general, who was the husband of Bathsheba, to cover his error. It was Nathan who said, "You are the one who is guilty of this great sin." Imagine the power and strength of that message, spoken to a man of great power, of great power. Indeed, the truth was known. Jesus did the same with his disciples, by the way, throughout his ministry. as we understand the stories that have come to us in the gospel accounts, there were times when the disciples really frustrated Jesus. And at one point he is reported as having said, "How long will I have to put up with you? How long will I have to put up with you?" Speaking to them out of his power, to those who thought they had power but had so little in reality. Jesus spoke to the Pharisees, who were the powerful interpreters of the law. What they said was truth, was the power that overtook any person who might think they knew better. It was the Pharisees who interpreted the law and then imposed it with great influence on the people of Judah and Israel. He said to them at one point, "You are whitewashed tombs." Whitewashed tombs? A tomb, which is a place for the dead, a place that's been whitewashed because of the filthiness of the place, but indeed their thinking and their interpretation and their leading of people down a path that would really cause greater pain and suffering. And they were identified as people who had, whitewashed their truth and making it appear to be truth. Jesus and his disciples oftentimes had encounters around the disciples who had this big argument as to who would be the greatest of them. Who would be the greatest of the disciples? Would it be Peter? Would it be John? Would it be James? Would it be Judas? Would it be any one of them? And Jesus understood that and said, "What are you talking about?" "Well, we're wondering who will be the greatest and who will be seated at your side when you come to your kingdom." Then he talked about who would be first and who would be last, and that neither one of them, none of them, were the greatest or the most important, and that indeed, if they humble themselves, their humility and their being last in their division of importance would be the thing that would likely place them in the favor of God's care. And now Jesus is talking to the disciples in a place where they're sharing now a meal together, remembering God's activity within the people of Israel as they find themselves captives of the people of Egypt. Great power, a great power. And they are remembering in this Pentecost, or in this, not Pentecost, in this supper that they're having together. And indeed, he says to them at the end, "One of you will leave me, and all of you will deny me." All of you will deny me. Peter then speaks as if he has spoken so often. He was the spokesman for the disciples frequently. "You are the Messiah." When Jesus asked, "Who do you say I am?" "You are the Messiah." Now Jesus is saying to them, "You will all abandon me. You will hide, you will scatter." And in fact, he predicts that Jesus will be denied by Peter no less than 3 times before the cock crows. So he is using his sense of what is true about the life and the faith of both the Pharisees and of the disciples, but true for him. And so he speaks truth to them. We are called upon as people of God to speak truth, and sometimes that truth is to power. A young man in our confirmation class, I remember at the first church I served, told me I was misspelling words. And then there appeared on the pulpit the next Sunday a dictionary. Well, that was a surprise, but I didn't, I was pretty much aware as to where that came from. Spoke truth to the power that he knew I had in creating the bulletin, and of the words that I use to share with people. So the need to speak for power is a way that we can gain truth and find truth that is indeed part of the life we live, not only within the church, but within the world in which we live. I want to call out and share with you yet one more comment that comes from C.S. Lewis. And it is the tail end of that comment that I shared in the Will You Consider section. C.S. Lewis summed up, I think, in a wonderful way, what seeking truth is all about and what the error in seeking truth can be. If you look for truth, you may find comfort in the end. If you look for comfort, you will not get either comfort nor truth. Only soft soap and wishful thinking to begin, and in the end, despair. So if you seek comfort, if you seek that instead of truth, indeed what you end up getting is neither truth or comfort, but you end up with despair. Jesus was trying to point out to the disciples that if they were going to be truthful to him, they needed to be honest about their doubts, honest about their fears, honest about their concerns, and then present them honestly to one another and to Jesus. And it wasn't literally until Jesus reappeared to them that they were aware of that. That what they had done indeed is they had denied him, they had abandoned him, they had hidden from him, but that indeed his truth was, I have been here with you, I have shared my good news of God's love for you, and for others, I have offered to you my life, and I'm back. And I want to remind you that you are part of my community, part of my communion, part of my life. That is the truth of the good news. Amen.